There continues to be much ill-informed public discussion on all sides about the perceived and real effects of counter-terrorism laws and their enforcement among some Australians of the Islamic faith. Since 2001, the ADA has always drawn the necessary distinction between the nature of Islamist terrorism as an extremist political religious movement involving only a minority of Muslims and the Islamic faith itself as practiced by most Muslims. In this regard, we have long pointed out that sloppy terminology such as Islamic or jihadi terrorism is both inaccurate and counterproductive, not least because it helps Islamists propagate the propaganda myth that the laws intended to counter only Islamist and other terrorism are somehow aimed instead at all Muslims and the Islamic faith itself. Such sloppy terminology and thinking not only aids Islamist recruitment, it also undermines both the Islamic community cooperation the police and ASIO needed to fight terrorism directly and counter-radicalisation measures within that community to fight terrorism indirectly and sustainably by highlighting the religious and theological bigotry inherent in Islamism. It's also worth noting at this juncture that other forms of inaccurate terminology are also very counterproductive in the fight against terrorism. For example, constant incorrect media and other reference to ASIO as a spy agency rather than a security intelligence one, and to its staff as spies rather than as intelligence officers, also assist Islamist propaganda, unnecessarily confuses law-abiding citizens of all faiths, and unnecessarily hampers Islamic and wider community cooperation with ASIO. The ADA respectfully suggests that the PJCIS should hammer this message home in every one of your reports. Our fourth and final general point concerns the problem caused by the high degree of persistent denial in parts of Australia's Islamic community that rejects any reference to or consideration of the purported theological basis of the Islamist message, no matter how bigoted or simplistic such theological interpretations may be in their misrepresentation. This persistent denial pervading Australia's Islamic community must be acknowledged in order to be eradicated, and we perhaps saw an example of this morning. If it is not confronted and eradicated within the Islamic community by that community, then the bigotry and other extreme beliefs sustaining their Islamist minority can never be effectively countered. This desire is often manifested by knee-jerk and scattergun false allegations of supposed Islamophobia by some of Australia's Islamic leaders and other Australians. It is clearly not somehow Islamophobic to highlight, for example, the high degree of Islamic community denial about Islamist terrorism, nor is it somehow phobic for any informed Australian to make legitimate and reasonable comment about the Islamic faith, or indeed any other faith generally. Having publicly discussed the necessary differences between Islamism and Islam for well over a decade, and generally well ahead of community awareness and discussion of this issue, the ADA notes a key point that is being wrongly downplayed in current public debate. Current and perhaps growing broader community criticism of Islamic community leaders is largely the result not of supposed Islamophobia, but of so much denial for so long by Islamic community leaders concerning the problematic minority of Islamists within their own community. As a telling example of the depth, longevity and continuing national consequences of such denial of an obvious problem, when participating in an SBS Insight program back in 2005, a then Vice President of the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils informed me, some 4 years after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, that he had personally never ever heard of the term Islamism. In the same Insight program, I was even criticised by some when politely pointing out that the positions advocated by the spokesman for Hizb ut-Tahrir participating in that program actually proved he was a religious bigot, not a mainstream Muslim. Before finishing, well, outside the specific terms of this inquiry, but of fundamental importance as a legal principle, the ADA wishes to briefly flag our unease at COAG's decision last week regarding future state and territory legislation to facilitate the indefinite detention of convicted terrorists after they've served their sentence. The mooted comparison with similar laws already allowing the continued detention of some pedophiles and exceptionally violent criminals is surely not valid. Terrorism is chiefly a political and/or religious act. While many and perhaps most terrorists have psychological or other mental health problems, the expert recommendations from psychologists and psychiatrists needed to indefinitely detain some paedophiles and exceptionally violent criminals may not readily apply to assessing terrorist prisoners. Moreover, the indefinite detention of terrorists, particularly Islamist ones, will counterproductively highlight their claims of religious martyrdom generally. More specifically, given the significant problem with Islamist propaganda already within our prisons, such martyrdom is likely to hamper counter-radicalisation measures within these facilities. The ADA understands that such indefinite detention is partly the result of insufficient resources to monitor released prisoners, even when placed under a control order, because of the growing number of potential terrorists and their sympathisers requiring monitoring already. The question here is surely whether a resourcing problem should result in diminution of the principle that prisoners should be released when they've completed their prison sentences. In conclusion, thank you again for inviting the ADA to contribute to this inquiry into the Counter-Terrorism Amendment Bill No. 1, 2005. I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions you may have.